The groundbreaking expose of conditions at Willowbrook State Hospital, combined with the resulting lawsuit and consent decree of 1975, brought major reforms to the way the developmentally disabled are integrated into society. It revolutionized care delivery with deinstitutionalization. Advocates continue to battle budget cuts and community ignorance to ensure that the rights of the disabled are preserved. Before the mid-1960s, the accepted practice for children and adults with developmental disabilities was to institutionalize them. Pediatricians encouraged families to place their disabled children. This was the only practice promoted within the medical field at the time. Despite this philosophy, some families raised their children at home around normal siblings with the hope that the child would learn from them and grow. This philosophy was later supported by Niels Erik Bank Mikkelsen, a doctor from Europe. He spoke at the President's Council on Mental Retardation Conference in 1966 and introduced normalization theory. This theory supports the belief that if allowed to live among higher functioning children and adults, the disabled increase their own capabilities. It supported inclusion, not exclusion, laying the foundation for deinstitutionalization.
Our doctor told us that she would recommend that you don't bring them home and just put them in an institution. Well, the two sisters and brothers, when they went out, he went out with them, and all their friends knew him, and he was one of the group.
Communities lacked services for the children who remained at home. Institutions were advertised as state-of-the-art centers for learning and care. Willowbrook State Hospital was one of them. Parents dreamed of what their disabled children could achieve there. Willowbrook started to accept disabled children and adults in 1951.
Well, they weren't coming from the perspective of being in an institution. They were really from the perspective of, in the 1970s, early 70s, to get her intensive physical and occupational therapy. And they had built $1 million infant rehabilitation center at Willowbrook. So it wasn't an institution, it was more going to a school that would allow us to have some hope.
By 1962, Willowbrook had 6,000 residents, twice the amount planned for. 75% of the residents had multiple handicaps, requiring many hours of specialized care. The New York State Office of Mental Health and Mental Retardation was faced with budget cuts each year, especially during the late 1960s and early 1970s, when the state was experiencing severe fiscal crisis. The disabled had no constitutional rights, and government officials were ignorant about what care and service was needed. Warehousing residents was acceptable. Staff layoffs continued and resources dwindled. News of the residents' neglect spread. In 1965, Senator Robert F. Kennedy visited Willowbrook. He and his family were passionate advocates for the disabled because his sister was disabled. The Staten Island Advance ran a series of articles titled, "What's Wrong with Willowbrook?" Responding to the negative publicity, Governor Rockefeller lifted the hiring freeze and distributed funds to Willowbrook, hoping to restore adequate care.
At the state institutions for the mentally retarded, and I think particularly at Willowbrook that we have a situation that borders on a snake pit.
It was too late. Willowbrook staff, parents, and advocates spoke publicly in an effort to give the residents a voice about their rights. The administrator of Willowbrook, Dr. Jack Hammond, claimed care was adequate considering the budget allocated.
It was horrible. It stank. People were screaming. It was just terrifying.
I went to Willowbrook a lot in the early 70s and was really shocked by how bad it was. A lot of them were naked, a lot of them were poorly clothed.
In 1966, legislation was introduced to provide funds to build homes which would have house parents live with the residents. Normalization theory had the support of the medical field, and deinstitutionalization was taking shape. Community resistance made progress slow. Neighborhoods protested, saying, "Not in my backyard." They feared what they did not understand. President Johnson made public service announcements encouraging the public to accept, employ, and educate the mentally retarded.
Go out into the playground, then she came back up and she could see. Well, he got out there and he was going with the other children, and mothers picked their children up and took them to the other side of the playground.
I felt great. I feel wonderful, just like any other person. You know,
I've gone to meetings, community board meetings, where people were screaming and holler and say, you know, not in my backyard. They're called them NIMBYs.
By 1971, conditions at Willowbrook were horrible. Warehousing 50 disabled in one room, filthy and naked, watched by 2 attendants, caught the public's attention. Suspicious deaths were reported. Employees Dr. Michael Wilkins and Elizabeth Lee spoke on behalf of the residents, and they were immediately fired. They, along with some parents, sprang into action. Joined by the Association of Retarded Children and the New York State Civil Liberties Union, they collectively brought a lawsuit against the state of New York and Willowbrook for the denial of the residents' rights to adequate care. A recent landmark case in Alabama, Wyatt v. Stickney, supported their lawsuit. It rules people and institutions have constitutional rights to receive individualized care to improve the quality of their lives.
And we developed a theory that once the state took someone into custody, it had an obligation to treat that person. And we argued that the people at Willowbrook were not being adequately treated. We thought that was an interesting legal theory, and so we filed a lawsuit to try and force the state to provide adequate treatment to the residents of Willowbrook.
The group needed the public support to advocate for reforms in care. Staten Island Advance reporter Jane Curran wrote a series exposing the conditions at Willowbrook. These articles caught the attention of ABC News reporter Geraldo Rivera. Mr. Rivera created a documentary exposing the neglect. He captured the nation's attention. He helped identify states and organizations promoting new models of care. California was one. Light years ahead of New York in 1972, the Center for Independent Living was founded there, and deinstitutionalization flourished.
There was one attendant for perhaps 50 severely and profoundly retarded children.
The ones that we saw were the most severely and profoundly retarded. There are thousands there like that, not going to school, sitting on the ward all day, not being talked to by anyone.
The lawsuit struggled in court for many years. In 1975, the consent decree was signed. Governor Carey agreed to support residents in the least restrictive and most normal living conditions possible. It promoted reforms in care and treatment for all the disabled, not just Willowbrook residents. He appointed a commissioner to oversee deinstitutionalization. She recruited not-for-profit agencies to increase housing opportunities. Judge Judd ordered Willowbrook's population reduced to 250 by 1981, but it didn't happen until 1986. Community resistance made implementation slow. Deinstitutionalization of people with mental illness was occurring around the same time. Communities were confusing mental illness with mental retardation and were scared and overwhelmed. Group homes had to survive for the reforms to succeed. The lawsuit settled in favor of the Willowbrook residents. To guarantee the promises of the decree were enforced, the court appointed the Willowbrook Review Panel. They would make sure the disabled had a voice in their care and were advocates of normalization theory.
That was my role as a psychologist. I was interviewing residents, making sure that we had appropriate group homes for them.
In 1978, the Office of Mental Retardation and Developmental Disabilities shifted its focus to the community. Promotion of public awareness and education about what the disabled were capable of was implemented. The office was responsible for prevention and early detection of developmental disabilities, services, care delivery, and living arrangements. Support for community awareness had already started with the introduction of the Special Olympics in 1969. In 1990, the American with Disabilities Act offered security to the reforms implemented. Willowbrook officially closed in 1987. It was renamed a developmental center and provided smaller group home living and day programs. The final settlement of the consent decree was signed in 1992. It outlined the expectations for care reform so there would never be another Willowbrook. In 2010, the state office was renamed the Office of People with Developmental Disabilities, making the word mentally retarded obsolete. It supports the disabled as being able.
Well, I think it's a very real concern of parents with children with disabilities is that the budget cuts.
Continued vigilance is needed to ensure that the reform in the treatment of the developmentally disabled is never jeopardized by budget cuts and ignorance again. Exclusion and warehousing must remain a thing of the past.